A badge can shine in daylight, but rot in the dark. Some systems aren't broken, they're working exactly as intended. It started with a traffic stop. No sirens, no reason. Just two officers and a woman they thought was easy to disappear. She had no badge showing, no security detail, just calm eyes and a name they didn't bother to check. So they planted the drugs, laughed, cuffed her like she was nothing. But the second her ID ran through the system, their world cracked open, because she wasn't just anyone. She was the director of the one agency powerful enough to take them all down. This isn't just about corruption. It's about what happens when power underestimates the wrong woman. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The road stretched out in front of her like a ribbon of silence, its edges swallowed by the low-lying desert haze, as Elise Monroe guided the rental car through the warm, drowsy light of late afternoon, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the horizon with the quiet focus of someone who had learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself with flashing lights or raised voices. The hum of the engine blended with the low, steady thrum of soul music drifting from the radio, Aretha Franklin's voice soft, steady, like a memory, wrapped in velvet, and for a moment, just a moment, Elise let herself breathe in rhythm with the music, her mind unclenching from the tight coils of Washington, D.C., responsibility, and the relentless weight of being one step ahead of people who didn't think she belonged where she was. She wore no makeup, no badge, no title. Just a charcoal gray zip-up sweater, well-worn jeans, and her hair pulled back into a low practical bun. Her phone was silent, face down in the cup holder beside her lukewarm coffee, and she hadn't touched it since leaving her brother's house just after sunrise, leaving behind the scent of pancakes and wood polish and the last echo of her niece's laughter fading down the hallway. She had only meant to stay one day, maybe two, but ended up lingering 3 folding towels in the laundry room, helping her niece with geometry, homework, and singing along to old Al Green tracks in socks that slipped across the hardwood floors. For 72 hours, she hadn't been Director Monroe, she had been Aunt Elise, and that had been enough. Now, with the highway almost empty, and the sun beginning its slow descent behind the red-brown hills, she felt the quiet pressing in thick like the heat just before a thunderstorm, the kind of silence that wasn't restful but watchful. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror and stayed there a beat too long. A dark cruiser had appeared behind her at some point, keeping its distance at first, then inching closer. No lights, no sirens, just presence. Elise checked her speed, 46 in a 50. No swerving, no phone in hand, both taillights working. Still the cruiser didn't pass. She inhaled slowly through her nose, exhaled through pursed lips, her body still, her mind sharpening. Just a routine patrol, she whispered to herself, not to reassure, but to test the sound of the lie. She tapped the turn signal and eased toward the shoulder, hoping they'd move past. They didn't. The cruiser mimicked her every move like a shadow with a badge. And then the lights came. No siren, just that quiet, commanding flash of red and blue in her mirror. Okay, she murmured, pulling fully onto the gravel shoulder hands already positioned at 10 and 2 before the tires had stopped rolling. The desert wind was faint but persistent, sliding dust across the windshield as she waited. A few cars passed in the opposite lane, the sound of their engines distant, detached like the world was somewhere else entirely. Elise didn't look at the cruiser directly, only tracked the movement in the mirror as the door opened, and a figure stepped out, broad-shouldered, deliberate, walking like someone who expected to be obeyed before he even spoke. Another door opened on the other side. 2 of them. She kept her posture straight, hands still visible, voice calm as the first officer approached the window. He knocked twice with his knuckle, a casual rhythm laced with authority. Elise rolled the window down halfway, kept her eyes forward. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a reason I was pulled over?" she asked, her voice low, even free of attitude, but entirely without fear. The officer didn't answer right away. He looked at her face, her hands, the dash, then back to her again. "License and registration," he said dryly, like a line rehearsed 1,000 times. "You drifted over the line back there." "I wasn't aware I had," Elise said evenly, already reaching toward the glove compartment, her movements slow and intentional. "But I'll get you what you need." She retrieved the registration, then her wallet, holding both out through the window. Her fingers didn't tremble. Not even slightly. The second officer had moved to the back of the vehicle, standing at an angle where he could see both her and the trunk. Elise knew that stance. It wasn't just tactical. It was practiced. These weren't rookies, and this wasn't random. "Where you headed?" the first officer asked, eyes still on the license. "Back to the city," she said, keeping it vague. He squinted at the card. "Elise Monroe," he muttered. "You visiting family?" She nodded once. "Yes." He handed the ID back, but didn't move, just stood there a moment too long. "Mind popping the trunk?" he asked casually, like someone asking for a favor, not issuing a demand. Elise turned her head slightly. "Is that a request or a legal order?" she asked, calm still, but with a slight edge now. The officer's mouth tightened. "Just to check. Standard procedure." Elise stared ahead, fingers resting on the steering wheel. "I'd like to know the basis for the search," she said. Behind her she could sense the second officer shifting the gravel, crunching beneath his boots. The first officer leaned in slightly, voice a little lower. "You can make this easy, or we can make it necessary." There it was, that shift in tone, subtle but clear. The line where suggestion became threat. Elise didn't move. "If you have probable cause, I'll comply," she said, each word precise. "Otherwise, I'd like to speak to your supervisor." The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was dense, like the moment before glass breaks. Then the officer smiled without warmth. "Pop it," he said again, not as a suggestion this time. Elise reached beneath the dash and pressed the release. She heard the soft click of the trunk unlatching, and then without turning she waited. Waited for what she already felt forming in her gut, cold and sure and familiar. This wasn't routine. This was performance. And she wasn't the audience. She was the target. The officer walked around the rear of the car with a slowness that didn't come from caution, but from control, the kind of deliberate pace used by people who want you to feel the time it takes for them to decide what happens next. His boots grinding into the gravel with each step like punctuation marks in a sentence you weren't allowed to finish. Elise stayed still, her hands still on the wheel, her spine straight, her breathing steady. But inside, she was counting 3 seconds for the trunk to open, 4 more for the pause, then silence, the kind that made your ears strain for sound, not because something loud was coming, but because something wrong already had. She didn't turn her head, didn't follow him with her eyes, didn't give either of them the satisfaction of nervous movement. Instead, she kept her gaze forward, locked on the horizon, on the place where the sky met the road, and things still made sense. Behind her, the second officer, a younger man with squared shoulders and an artificial confidence, moved closer to the back of the sedan, and she could hear the soft shuffle of his gloved hands rifling through a trunk he had no legal right to open. There was a metallic click, a pause, and then a sharp intake of breath, more performance than surprise. "Well," the younger one said, voice louder, now pitched just enough to carry. "Looks like she forgot to mention this." She heard the sound of plastic pinched between fingers, the unmistakable rustle of a bag, and a beat. Later, the older officer stepped back into view, holding a clear pouch with a pale powder inside, raising it just high enough for her to see in the mirror. "You want to explain this?" he asked, tone flat, but with an undercurrent of accusation already hardening into certainty. Elise turned her head slowly, not sharply, not with shock, just enough to meet his eyes, her voice calm, deliberate, unwavering. "That was not in my car," she said, enunciating each word like she was writing them in stone. He tilted his head, slightly amused, or pretending to be. "You sure about that?" "I'm certain," she replied. The younger one stepped closer now, his stance shifting subtly as his hand moved near his belt. Not quite a threat, but close enough to feel like one. "You got something you want to confess, ma'am?" he asked, feigning curiosity while his fingers tapped near the edge of his holster. Elise kept her hands on the wheel. "No confession," she said, "but I do want your badge numbers and your supervisor on scene." The older officer's face shifted just a twitch, a curl at the edge of his mouth. "You think this is DC?" he said, voice low, now leaning in so she could feel the heat of it on her skin. "Out here we do things different. You play smart, we play rough." He leaned back just slightly enough to make room for the younger one to step in, now holding the bag at eye level like a prize. "Looks like possession," he said, "and resisting a search. That's obstruction." Elise inhaled once slowly, deeply, her eyes never leaving theirs. "I didn't resist. I asked for the law. And what you're holding wasn't in my possession until you put it there." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake, but it carried with it the weight of every courtroom she'd ever stood, in every suspect she'd ever watched, lie every file she'd ever signed to clear someone who never should have been accused. The younger officer Reams, she noted from his nameplate, flicked his gaze to his partner, unsure for a split second. The older one didn't waver. "Out of the car," he said flatly, already reaching for the handle. Elise locked eyes with him. "Not without a supervisor present," she said, "and not without a legal basis for arrest." "You got one now," he muttered, yanking the door open and grabbing her arm with more force than necessary, enough to pull her half out of the seat before her other hand could even leave the wheel. Reams moved fast, leaning across her to unbuckle the seatbelt, his elbow brushing her ribcage, his movements sharp, practiced, brutal. The air outside hit her like a slap-dry sharp, carrying the smell of sun-baked dust and diesel. They pulled her from the car like someone dragging trash to the curb. Not a citizen, not a person, but an obstacle. Her feet hit the gravel hard, her boots slipping slightly as she was spun around and shoved toward the trunk, her arms twisted behind her back with a precision meant not just to restrain, but to hurt. The cuffs clicked shut tighter than necessary. "Easy," she said, her voice clipped now, more out of control than pain. "There's no need for force." "Stop resisting," Reams snapped, though she wasn't moving, wasn't pulling away, wasn't doing anything except breathing. The older officer Hollister, according to the tag just above his gritted jaw, pushed her once more toward the rear bumper. "This is what happens when people think they're smarter than the law," he said. Elise turned her head slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. "This isn't law," she said. "This is abuse, and you know it." He didn't answer, just tightened his grip on her arm and opened the back door of the cruiser with his free hand. "Get in!" She ducked instinctively, her body folding into the hard plastic interior of the back seat, her spine stiff against the molded shell, the cuffs biting into her wrists every time she shifted. Through the windshield, she could see the sky still open, still golden, still pretending nothing had happened. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in a silence that didn't soothe but smothered. Outside, they moved slowly, purposefully speaking into radios, filing lies in real time. Elise closed her eyes for half a second, not to rest but to record. Every word, every face, every angle of motion she stored like evidence in a vault. She didn't need a warrant to open. Whatever came next, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't about a stop or a search or a mistake. This was about the kind of power that smiled, while it lied, the kind that framed without hesitation, the kind that never imagined the woman they'd just arrested might be the one person built to bring their entire world crashing down. The cruiser rolled into the station's rear lot beneath a sky fading from dusty gold to slate gray, the kind of late evening light that softened everything except the truth which Elise could feel tightening around her wrists and pressing into her lower spine as the handcuffs cut deeper with every bump in the road. Neither officer spoke during the drive, and Elise didn't ask questions. Her silence wasn't surrender but precision, a measured choice to absorb, to note, to remember each mile, each glance exchanged between the two men in the front seat, flicker of unease that passed like static through the rearview mirror. She counted the turns, memorized the route, catalogued the smell of worn vinyl and stale coffee, and the dull rattle of something loose in the trunk, her breath steady, her posture straight, despite the awkward angle forced by the cuffs, because she had been trained to endure much worse than this, and still, this felt different. This felt personal. When they arrived, the cruiser slid into a dimly lit bay behind the station, the kind of place where no one asked questions and cameras pointed just a little too high. Reams got out first, his movements quick and jerky, now the false bravado of earlier replaced by something more anxious, more uncertain. Hollister came around slower, his jaw clenched, his eyes colder, and when he opened the door, his hand gripped her arm a bit too tightly, like he was trying to remind himself who had control. "Let's go," he muttered, pulling her from the back seat with a tug that lacked ceremony but not intention. Elise didn't resist, didn't stumble, didn't give them anything more than what was necessary. Her boots hit the concrete floor with a soft, steady sound as she walked between them, her gaze forward, her expression unreadable because giving them her fear would be like handing over her name, and that she wasn't ready to do just yet. Inside, the air changed. It was colder, lined with the scent of bleach and sweat, and something metallic lingering near the edges, like old pennies and disinfectant, mixed with bad judgment. The hallway was narrow, the tiles scuffed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of unseen flies. They passed a vending machine humming faintly, a bulletin board covered in curled notices and faded mugshots, and a door labeled "Booking" in peeling white letters. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and reading glasses balanced on the bridge of his nose, barely looked up as they approached. "What have we got?" he asked, voice flat with routine. "Possession," Hollister said, dropping her ID onto the counter. "And obstruction." The sergeant reached for the keyboard, typing with 2 fingers, slow and mechanical. "Name," Elise Monroe, Hollister said without thinking. The moment the sergeant entered the name, something shifted, first in his posture, then in the light from the monitor. His fingers paused, hovering over the keyboard like they'd forgotten what they were supposed to do. He typed again, faster this time, frowning as a new screen loaded, one with darker borders and sharper font. He leaned forward, squinting, reading something Elise couldn't see, and then looked up at her, really looked, this time not like a suspect, but like someone he wasn't supposed to be seeing in handcuffs. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath, not to her, not to the officers, but to himself, and he stepped back slightly, hand moving toward the landline beside the terminal, with a kind of urgency that didn't match the slow pace of everything that had come before. "What's the issue?" Hollister snapped, tension leaking into his voice like a crack in glass. The sergeant didn't answer. He picked up the phone and dialed a short internal number, his voice dropping into a low murmur as he glanced at the screen again. Elise watched him carefully, her pulse steady, but her thoughts quickening. He had seen something big enough to make him pale, to make him fumble, to make him call for backup in a place where backup usually wasn't needed. A moment later he hung up and turned toward Hollister and Reams, his tone sharper now. "Both of you, conference room, now." They exchanged glances, not just confused, but suddenly on edge, as if the rules had shifted mid-game, and they hadn't noticed until the board was already gone. "What's going on?" Reams asked, his voice cracking just slightly. The sergeant didn't explain. "Do it," he said again, firmer this time, and after a few seconds of hesitation, they moved, stepping away from Elise like she'd started glowing. The moment they disappeared behind the closed door, the sergeant returned to the desk and reached for the key to her cuffs. His hands were quick but shaking. "Ma'am," he said, avoiding her eyes, "I'm going to need your phone." Elise handed it over without resistance. "It's personal property," he added, voice thinner. "Now we'll log it and return it." "I'd like to make a call," she said calmly. He nodded, not answering. He sat back down, typed something else into the system, and then, just as the screen refreshed, a new sound filled the room. A sharp digital ping, followed by a red alert banner flashing across the top of the screen. The sergeant's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes darted between the monitor and Elise, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Director Monroe," he said quietly. We didn't know." Elise didn't move, didn't nod, didn't smirk. She only said one thing, her voice cool but clear. "Then find out who did." The evidence room smelled like cold metal and sealed decisions, the air still and sterile under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with a faint static hum, the kind of silence that made even the sound of a clipboard tapping against a countertop feel intrusive. Elise stood near the doorway, no longer in cuffs, her presence now met with quiet deference by officers who only an hour earlier had likely passed around coffee without imagining they'd soon be under federal scrutiny. The technician on duty, a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, walked toward her with the unsteady pace of someone who had just realized his normal Tuesday had become something historic. He cleared his throat, offered her a clipboard, and spoke in a tone caught between apology and protocol. "This is the intake sheet for the narcotics bag," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Logged by Reams 23 minutes ago." Elise took the clipboard, her fingers steady, her breath even, but as her eyes scanned, the form a tightness began to coil behind her ribs, a slow, coiled thing born not of surprise but confirmation. The tag number on the clear bag matched a series she had ordered resealed just 6 weeks earlier, confiscated materials from a multi-state DEA operation tied to cartel trafficking, secured under federal authority, and routed to an off-site vault in New Mexico for deep archive review. "This was never supposed to be here," she said, more to herself than anyone else, her voice quiet but laced with something deeper disbelief, wrapped around rage, the kind that came when you realized someone hadn't just crossed a line, they walked into your house and used your own rules to break you. She turned to the technician. "This tag was logged under a classified routing system. There is no way it ended up in a local cruiser by accident." He nodded slowly, lips tightening. "That's what we thought too. So we ran the serial twice. It's real, but it's not from our internal chain. The label's DEA, but the trace code, that's federal-grade packaging." Elise looked back down at the bag, now resting under a glass panel, sealed and documented like it had walked itself in. "Someone pulled it from a federal evidence lockup," she said, each word more certain than the last. "And they did it using clearance codes they were never supposed to have." The room seemed to grow colder as the implications unfurled around her one layer at a time. This wasn't sloppy corruption. This was surgical. Someone had breached the very infrastructure she was hired to protect, bypassed multiple levels of clearance, and placed that breach directly into her path, not to catch her, but to test something, to test the system, to test her. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She stepped away from the glass and answered it without checking the screen. "Monroe," she said, her voice crisp. "Director," came the reply. "Deputy Agent Kane from the Digital Forensics Unit. We finished the trace on the original routing log for that evidence bag. You're going to want to see this." Elise glanced at the technician, gave a small nod, then turned toward the hallway. "I'm on my way." The walk to the internal ops suite was short, but every step felt like peeling back a floorboard in a house you'd once thought was solid. As she entered the room, Kane turned from a row of monitors, her expression grim. "This is the code sequence tied to the tag from the bag," she said, pointing at a screen filled with cascading lines of green and white text. "It links directly to Operation Sable, your sting in El Paso from last quarter. The narcotics were logged, sealed, and marked for transfer. But look here." She highlighted a timestamp. "The inventory was digitally rerouted 2 days after the bust reassigned to a secondary depot in Georgia. A depot that doesn't exist in official DEA records." Elise leaned in, her brow furrowed. "So who rerouted it?" Kane hesitated. "That's the part that gets worse. The clearance code used belonged to Director Harwood." Elise blinked. "Harwood retired last year." "Exactly," Kane said. "Which means someone reactivated his credentials, temporarily. Enough to log the transfer, then shut the account down again." Elise took a breath slow and measured her fingers pressed against the edge of the monitor. "And no one flagged it until now." "No," Kane said softly. "Because whoever did it used an administrative override. A ghost layer in the system, something deep. Legacy infrastructure." The room felt narrower now, the air more brittle. Elise stepped back, folding her arms, her voice low but firm. "I want full access to the routing logs, audit trails, and every known instance of administrative overrides in the past 90 days. If there's a backdoor in our system, I want to know who built it and who's using it." Kane nodded. "Already started." And Director Elise raised an eyebrow. "Whoever did this, they didn't just want to frame someone. They picked you on purpose." Elise didn't respond right away. She turned back to the monitor, her eyes scanning the data again, but this time she wasn't looking for confirmation. She was looking for patterns. Because this wasn't about 2 crooked cops in a forgotten precinct. It wasn't even about the bag in her trunk. This was about access. Someone had used a dead man's identity to smuggle federally sealed product back onto the street, handed it to officers trained in planting and performing, and then aimed it directly at the one person with the authority to shut the whole thing down. That wasn't coincidence. That was calculus. And if they thought she'd back down because they made it personal, they didn't know Elise Monroe. She turned toward the door, her voice steady. "Pull every station tied to that reroute code. I want a map of transfers, reroutes, and ghost depots across the southeast." Kane nodded again, already tapping at the keys. Elise paused, her hand on the frame of the doorway, then added without turning back, "And check for repeat officer names. If this was a play, I want to know who's been running it." Then she walked out, her pace steady, her mind no longer focused on surviving the frame. It was already shifting into something sharper, building the case. Because if they'd come for her with her own evidence, she was going to come for them with theirs. And she wasn't walking in with a badge. She was bringing the whole damn system. The conference room smelled faintly of printer ink and old dust, the kind that lingered in buildings that hadn't been properly audited in years, and Elise sat at the head of the long metal table with her fingers loosely laced, staring at a digital map displayed on the wall that pulsed with red dots, each one a traffic stop, a booking, or a report that had slipped through unnoticed until now. Her back was straight, her gaze sharp, but inside her chest was a slow burn, a quiet fury that settled deeper with every name, every location, every pattern that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop treating corruption like a surprise and start treating it like structure. Agent Julia Kane stood near the screen with a remote in hand, her posture tense but composed, walking Elise through the clusters one by one. 57 stops across 3 counties, she said, voice even but clipped. 32 arrests filed, all for either possession or intent to distribute. 26 of those were people of color, and 24 occurred outside dashcam coverage zones. Elise leaned forward slightly, her voice low, and the arresting officers. Julia hesitated. Almost all linked to either Hollister Reams or their known associates. Same units, same shifts, sometimes the exact same language in their reports. A long silence followed, filled only by the soft hum of the ceiling vent and the rhythmic click of Kane's remote. Elise's fingers tightened. "How far back does this go?" 18 months conservatively, Julia replied. "Possibly more, but body cam records are missing in over half the cases." Elise stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her shadow stretching across the glowing map like a question. "They didn't just make arrests," she said. "They built a rhythm." She walked toward the display, pointing to a string of stops along a state route, cutting between rural townships and defunded districts. Right here they knew these were soft zones. No oversight, no media, no audits. Just asphalt and silence. Julia nodded. "Exactly. And it gets worse. We pulled internal records from the county database, and in 10 of these cases, the evidence seized never made it into inventory." Elise turned to her sharply. "You're telling me it vanished?" "Not vanished," Julia said. "Redirected. Either mislabeled as hazardous and destroyed, or never logged at all. There's no official trail, but surveillance footage from the precinct garage shows officers carrying untagged bags into unregistered vehicles." Elise exhaled through her nose, not from surprise, but from recognition. This wasn't improvisation, it was a script. "They knew the holes in the system," she murmured. "They weren't operating around protocol, they were counting on it." Julia moved to another part of the board, highlighting a different quadrant. "Here's the worst of it. One stop resulted in a fatality. A 22-year-old man, Jordan Lamar, booked for resisting arrest, found dead in custody 2 hours later, ruled suicide. No body cam, no cell video, no interviews. The name hit like a sharp stone dropped into a still lake, sudden quiet, rippling outward. Elise closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them and walked back to her seat. "I want the full file," she said. "Everything you can find, arrest report, medical examiner notes, internal memos." Julia handed her a thin folder. "Already pulled. It's light. Too light." Elise opened the file, her eyes scanning the printed lines with a heaviness she hadn't felt in years. Each word on the page an echo of a system that wrote itself clean before anyone could ask why it was dirty. Jordan had no priors. He had called his mother from holding just after intake, scared but coherent. 90 minutes later, he was found hanging from a torn bedsheet in a cell with no active surveillance. The intake log was missing a supervisor's signature. The autopsy report mentioned ligature marks, but no signs of restraint, despite an eyewitness statement buried in the notes that said they saw him pulled from his car, cuffed and slammed into the hood, hard enough to leave a dent. Elise closed the folder, not slowly, not dramatically, just firmly. "They killed him," she said quietly. Julia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elise turned to her analyst. "Check the intake roster for that night. Look for other detainees, even if they were processed separately. Cross-reference with phone call logs. If anyone else called home, I want those calls flagged." Julia nodded, already typing. And Jordan's mother, Elise, paused, her jaw tight. "We visit her. In person." The room was still for a moment, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from restraint. Elise looked around at her team. We treat every one of these like an open wound. Every arrest, every log entry, every missing frame of footage. This isn't random, this is orchestrated. Kane adjusted the screen. There's more. Some of the evidence tags were logged under names we've seen before, officers transferred from other counties, some with internal complaints that never reached review boards. Elise narrowed her eyes. Are they still active? Some, Kane replied. Some vanished right before review dates. Some were promoted. Elise didn't speak right away. She stood, crossed her arms, and let the room breathe in that final word. Promoted. A word that should have meant trust, meant accountability, but here it smelled like complicity. She walked slowly toward the door, then turned back. Start pulling old task force rosters, anything tied to narcotics or roadside interdiction. Look for names that repeat, especially ones tied to seizures that disappeared in transit. And if we find one, Kane asked. Elise's voice didn't waver. Then we're not investigating a ring, we're exposing a network. And with that she stepped out the hallway, stretching ahead like a dark corridor through a house no one had cleaned in years, her footsteps steady as she moved deeper into the story no one wanted told, but that she was now determined to finish. The fluorescent lights in the tech forensics lab flickered faintly as Elise stepped through the doorway, her heels muffled by the short industrial carpet that always felt too clean, too sterile, like a place built for machines, not for memory. The hum of the server banks was a steady, low chorus in the background, and the air smelled of plastic casing and burnt dust, the residue of a system that never slept, only watched. At the center of the room stood Julia Kane, posture upright, but with tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there 2 days ago, her eyes glued to a terminal that displayed cascading lines of code like falling rain, except this wasn't random and it wasn't beautiful. Elise walked slowly, deliberately, each step carrying the weight of too many revelations stacked on too little time. You said you found something buried, she asked, voice steady but edged with expectation. Julia nodded without turning her fingers, tapping a few keys, until the screen froze on a series of command logs, labeled with timestamps, access IDs, and internal routing signatures. I was running post-arrest diagnostics on the evidence manipulation. She began gesturing toward the top line. That's when I found this, an override entry from a non-active DEA profile dated back 6 years. It shouldn't be able to log in, let alone reroute product. Elise leaned in, reading the metadata closely, her brow knitting slightly. Whose profile? James Otley, Julia said quietly. Senior systems architect. Died of cancer in 2017. His credentials were retired, flagged, removed from active servers. Elise's breath caught not in fear, but in the realization that someone had dug deep into the bones of a system she once thought was flawed but recoverable and turned it into something undead. So someone resurrected a dead ID to authorize drug movement. Not just movement, Julia replied. Full manipulation, rerouting, backdating, even log deletion. It gets worse. The activity was tunneled through an old tool we thought was decommissioned. She pulled up another window, the interface, a stark contrast to modern systems, boxy, gray-toned, running on legacy architecture that hadn't been touched since before smartphones became standard. Elise squinted at the name in the corner of the screen. Xeno, she said, slowly, testing the word like it might mean something more than it did. Julia nodded. It was originally an auditing layer built for cross-agency integration after 9/11s. Never meant to modify, just observe. But someone at some point embedded executable commands inside it, and now it's been repurposed into a digital ghost. The room felt colder now, like the lights themselves had dimmed slightly, under the weight of the truth that had just stepped into the open. Elise straightened her arms, crossed her thoughts, circling faster than her breath could keep up. If Xeno can write delete and reassign inventory, it's not just a back door. It's a portal. Exactly, Julia said. And it's invisible unless you know where to look. The code triggers only under admin-level tasks, routed through defunct clearance layers. It operates inside outdated protocols, ones that most departments have already forgotten existed. Elise began pacing slowly, her steps quiet but full of focus. That's why no one caught the reroutes. The system didn't flag them as foreign, it read them as legacy maintenance. And because no one's supposed to be using Xeno anymore, Julia added, it doesn't alert oversight when it's accessed. It's like a closet in a house everyone assumes is empty. Elise stopped walking, her eyes narrowing as her mind started knitting the pieces together. And whoever's using it is counting on that invisibility. They're not just hiding evidence, they're rewriting reality. She turned back to Julia, her voice low. How long has it been active? Hard to say, Julia admitted. But based on the code architecture, I'd bet it never stopped. We just stopped noticing. Elise walked to the window overlooking the parking lot, gray sky, cracked asphalt, a few scattered cars sitting quiet under the early morning light. So we've been operating inside a system with a ghost in the walls, she said. One that was born out of national security, then forgotten, and now, she paused. Now it's being used to cover organized abuse, maybe even fund it. Julia stepped beside her, her voice softer now. We found Zeno because your name triggered the wrong response. When your ID was entered at booking, it tripped a failsafe hidden under the federal access layer. The system recognized you as a level 5 authority, but there was a delay. It should have responded in 10 seconds. It took 90. Elise turned to face her voice, calm but sharp. They were watching. Julia nodded once. They wanted to see how long it would take. And when the system finally responded, they vanished. There was silence between them then, not awkward, not afraid, just heavy with the understanding that this thing they were unraveling wasn't just about rogue cops or a broken policy. It was about a structure someone had built beneath the surface of government, layered in legal jargon, cloaked in old code, and given just enough time to root itself into every vulnerable place the system refused to examine. Elise looked back at the screen at the name Zeno, blinking in the corner like a dare. Find out who touched it last, she said. I want the full chain access logs, transfer IDs, anything that even brushed this system in the last 12 months. And if they scrubbed the trail, Julia asked. Elise didn't blink. Then we follow the fingerprints they thought didn't matter, the misfiled codes, the duplicate reports, the small edits that didn't match inventory. People like that always forget the noise. They're too obsessed with making it clean. Julia returned to her terminal, already pulling fresh lines of code. Elise remained still. Her jaw set her thoughts, now laser-focused on one truth she could no longer ignore. This wasn't about damage control. This was about finding the architect of the lie and tearing down the house he built before another innocent was buried under paperwork and silence. The house stood at the end of a narrow street where the sidewalks cracked under the weight of years, and weather, its paint faded, but carefully touched up its porch, swept clean, and a single wind chime knocking gently in the breeze like a nervous heartbeat that hadn't calmed in months. Elise parked across from the small brick home engine, still ticking as it cooled, and sat for a moment with her hands resting in her lap, staring at the front door, trying to find the right breath, before walking into a place where truth wasn't a theory. It was personal and permanent, and heavy with the silence left behind by someone who should have come home. She stepped out of the car slowly, her coat catching the edge of the wind, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes with each measured step. And by the time she reached the gate, a curtain inside the living room window had already shifted, just enough to say someone was watching, but not yet ready to welcome. Elise didn't blame them. She knew the expression that came next, the look of someone tired of reporters, of unanswered calls, of apologies too late to matter. When the door finally opened, it did so with care, not caution. A woman stood in the frame, older than Elise, expected maybe in her late 50s, early 60s, shoulders drawn in slightly hands, wiping unconsciously at the edge of her sweater, as if trying to steady something inside her chest. Elise Monroe, she said gently, offering a soft nod, not reaching for a handshake. Federal Office of Institutional Integrity. The woman blinked, not in surprise, but in that slow registering way of someone who had waited too long for someone to care. I'm Jordan's mother, she said. You already knew that, I guess. Elise nodded. Yes, ma'am. May I come in? The woman stepped back without a word, leading her through the threshold into a living room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, the kind of scent that wrapped around childhood memories and grief all at once. They sat on a couch that had probably seen decades of Sunday conversations and quiet arguments, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Elise glanced at the photos on the mantel, school pictures, church events, graduation. Jordan was smiling in all of them, wide and genuine, the kind of smile that didn't know yet how cruel the world could be when no one was looking. "I don't want a report," the mother said, quietly breaking the silence. "I don't want more forms or meetings. I just want to know if someone is finally telling the truth." Elise leaned forward slightly, her voice low and unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to tell you what happened to your son was not a suicide, and it was not a mistake." The woman didn't cry, didn't gasp, didn't fold into herself the way Elise had seen others do. She simply nodded once, then closed her eyes. "Then say it plain," she whispered. "Say it in a way I can carry." Elise did. She told her about the officers, about the pattern, about the missing footage, and the recycled drugs, and the name Jordan Lamar buried in a file that no one had planned to read again. She explained how they had used old systems to hide new crimes, how people with badges had taken advantage of dark corners in the database, how her team had found the cracks and followed them all the way to the center. When she finished, the woman looked at her with a quiet, aching strength that Elise recognized not from briefing rooms or courtrooms, but from kitchens like this one, where the weight of survival was passed like recipes between generations. "I told them he was scared," she said, her voice like a page worn thin from being read too many times. "He called me that night and he said, 'Mama, I didn't do anything.' I swear I didn't do anything." Elise didn't respond with comfort. She didn't offer a false promise or empty reassurance. She only said he didn't. They sat together a while longer, the silence now different, not empty, but shared. Before Elise left, she handed the woman a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of the reopened investigation order signed by the DOJ and countersigned by Elise herself, alongside a direct contact line for her team. "If anyone tells you it's too late to matter," she said gently, "you give them this." The woman took it with both hands and held it like something sacred, not because it fixed anything, but because it meant someone finally stopped pretending it wasn't broken. As Elise stepped back into the daylight, the wind had picked up, tugging slightly at her coat as she crossed the street and paused at the edge of the curb. She looked back once, just once, and saw the woman still standing in the doorway, the envelope clutched close to her chest, her shoulders squared just a little straighter than before. Elise knew what came next wouldn't be easy, wouldn't be clean, and wouldn't come with applause, but it would come with clarity. Back at headquarters, Julia met her in the operations room, eyes wide, with something between urgency and disbelief. "You need to see this," she said, motioning her toward the screen. "We found a bystander video. It was uploaded to a community page a week after Jordan was arrested. It was flagged and deleted for unrelated content, but a civil rights group archived it during a digital sweep. The video was grainy, taken from across the street, the audio muddled, but the footage clear enough." Elise watched as Jordan was pulled from his car, hands raised not resisting, while Officer Hollister slammed him into the hood hard enough to make someone flinch off camera. Officer Reams followed, opening the cruiser's back door and helping shove Jordan inside his knee, pressed into the boy's side with more force than necessary. There was no urgency in their movements, no fear, just routine. Elise paused the video, the frame freezing on Jordan's face, half-turned expression blank, not with confusion but resignation. She turned to Julia, her voice flat but burning. "We use this. Everything we've got. We reopen every case connected to these officers, and we dig until the last name they buried is the one that brings the whole thing down." Julia nodded, her eyes sharp. "They didn't expect us to look this closely." Elise replied, without blinking. "That's how you know we're getting close." And with that, she turned back to the screen, not to watch the video again, but to memorize it, because what they were building now wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. The diner sat just off a desolate stretch of highway, the kind of place where the parking lot was always half empty, and the coffee came in chipped ceramic mugs that had outlived their original owners, and Elise chose it on purpose, not because it was safe, but because it was forgotten. The sun had dipped low behind a line of distant cottonwoods, painting the windows in long streaks of amber and rust, and inside the jukebox in the corner played an old soul track. No one had chosen its melody, faint beneath the hum of a flickering overhead light. She slid into a booth near the back wall, her coat still zipped halfway, her breath slower now, but her mind moving like a current just beneath the surface. She didn't bring a file. She didn't need one. Not for this meeting. What she needed was something far more difficult to summon in places like this: trust. The man who finally entered looked like time had stopped for him. A decade too late, his shoulders stooped under the weight of choices that never made the reports, his gray beard uneven and his eyes darting too often for comfort. He scanned the room like someone trained to expect a trap, and when he finally slid into the seat across from her, he didn't speak right away. Elise waited, studying his hands, scarred steady but with a slight tremor that hadn't come from age. "You're Monroe," he said, finally, his voice low, rough like gravel under boots. Elise nodded. "And you're Briggs." He gave a humorless chuckle. "I used to be." She tilted her head slightly, not pushing, not probing, just letting the silence make room for what he clearly hadn't said in a long time. He took a breath, exhaled through his nose, then looked out the window like he needed to see the dark to say it. "You think this thing you found is new," he said. "You think it started with them boys who planted that bag in your trunk?" Elise didn't answer. He shook his head. "It didn't. It started long before that. Before me even. I was just one of the ones too slow to run and too stubborn to play along." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low and deliberate now, like every word was being pushed uphill. "We had a name for it back then, the doctrine, but that's just what they called it when they didn't want to write it down. The real term was Red River, started as a task force. Official, DEA, local fusion teams, even some customs in border zones. Supposed to be about cutting off cartel supply routes, intercepting before product hit the cities. And at first, maybe it was." Elise listened unmoving, her face unreadable, but her mind tracing every phrase against what she already knew. But when the busts got big, when the seizures started stacking and the paperwork couldn't keep up, they built a second chain, a ghost chain. Product that never got logged. Evidence that never hit the database. Sometimes it got stored, sometimes it got sold, sometimes it just disappeared into unmarked vans in precinct parking lots. But every time someone raised a question, the system answered with silence. Briggs rubbed a hand across his mouth, then looked at her directly. "And you know what made it work?" She waited. "The uniform. People don't question a man in a badge walking out the back of a warehouse with a duffel bag. Not if it's labeled Federal Hold. Not if the right name's on the clipboard. We were trained to look official while we cleaned up the mess." Elise's voice was calm when it finally came. "And when did you stop?" He smiled again, but there was nothing warm in it. "When a kid I didn't know bled out in the backseat of a cruiser because someone mistook fear for resistance. When I tried to file a report and found my access had been downgraded. When I realized the cameras in the holding cells were always broken when certain people were brought in." She sat back, slightly absorbing the confession, not as news but as confirmation. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me this now?" He looked down, folding and unfolding the edge of a napkin between his fingers. "Because they're still using it. The framework. The people. Maybe not under the same name. Maybe not in the same precinct. But the same pattern." He met her gaze again. "And because your arrest didn't scare them, it woke them up." The server passed by with a coffee refill. Neither of them touched it. Elise leaned forward. "You have names, not all of them," Briggs replied. "But I got places. Stations where the ghost chain still runs. I can give you 4 jurisdictions where similar product vanished after major busts. Same reporting gaps, same badge numbers showing up in different counties 6 months apart." Elise reached into her coat, pulled out a slim recorder and set it on the table without pressing start. "I'm not here to burn you," she said, "but I am here to bring it down. All of it." Briggs nodded slowly. "Then you'd better move fast, because if they know you've got Zeno, they know they're running out of time." They sat in silence again, the kind that wasn't heavy with guilt but thick with resolve. Elise finally stood, slipping a card across the table. "This line is untraceable. If anything shifts, you call." Briggs picked it up, glanced at the number, and tucked it into his jacket. "They'll come for me, you know," he said quietly, "if they think I talked." "They won't find you," Elise said, turning toward the door, "but they'll know someone finally did." And with that, she stepped back into the night, the air colder, now the stars sharper, the world unchanged, but somehow more exposed, like a curtain had lifted, and what had once passed for darkness now felt like a spotlight. She didn't feel relief, didn't feel fear, only forward, only the sound of her boots on concrete, and the certainty that the story had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The desert looked empty from above, but Elise had learned long ago that emptiness was just another kind of disguise, a false comfort wrapped in silence and heat. And as the convoy of unmarked SUVs crawled along the old military access road toward the abandoned airstrip, her eyes scanned every ridge, every shadow, every stretch of sand that curved just a little too smooth, like it had been recently disturbed. The operation had taken less than 24 hours to assemble a rapid deployment stitched together from federal marshals, DEA strike agents, and 2 cyber analysts working in a mobile command unit 20 miles out their screens, glowing like lanterns in a storm. Inside the lead vehicle, Elise sat in the front passenger seat, suited in tactical black, with her badge clipped low and her weapon strapped snug beneath her coat, not because she intended to fire first, but because she no longer had the luxury of assuming the other side wouldn't planks. Her breathing was steady, her hands still, but the pressure behind her eyes pulsed in a way that told her everything was moving faster, now too fast for politics, too fast for cover stories, just fast enough to crash into the truth before it found a way to disappear again. The voice over the comms came low and clear. "We're 2 minutes out, no signs of movement. Drone confirms 3 vehicles stationary near the fuel depot." Elise leaned forward slightly. "Any heat signatures?" "6 total," the voice replied. "No uniforms, but body language reads trained. One's pacing 2 on overwatch." She turned to Salgado, seated behind the wheel with his jaw tight, and his fingers wrapped around the wheel like he was waiting for permission to hit something. "We're not here to negotiate," she said. "If they run, we follow. If they shoot, we finish it." He nodded, once flicking on the internal comm. "All teams go red. We breach on my mark." The other vehicles split off as the convoy neared the perimeter, 2 flanking wide to cover the ridge, another circling behind the rusted-out hangars to cut off any escape route. Elise glanced at the dry weeds brushing the edge of the runway, the way the wind carried no scent here, just heat and dust, and the crackle of old secrets buried beneath concrete that had forgotten the sound of planes. The first shots didn't come until the SUVs skidded to a halt and the agents burst from their doors, boots hitting ground like thunder, weapons drawn in tight formations, shouts of federal agents, hands in the air bouncing off the hangar walls, before a single muzzle flash answered from the far end of the tarmac. Elise dropped low behind the open door, drawing her weapon in one fluid motion, scanning the scene like a chessboard, mid-game, her mind tracking angles, exits, and impact zones, as the air filled with the high-pitched snap of suppressed rifles and the bark of return fire. Salgado moved first, flanking left with a team of 3 disappearing into the side of the hangar where the shadows swallowed them whole. Elise motioned to Naomi Kersey on her right eyes, sharp expression unreadable, before leading the secondary team forward, under cover of the blast shields now pinned to the SUVs. She could hear the pop of smoke grenades going off ahead, thick clouds of gray curling upward and folding light into itself, and then a scream, a short, ragged sound followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the dirt. They reached the depot in less than 30 seconds. And Elise was through the doorway before she could think, sweeping the room left to right, heart pounding not with fear but clarity, the kind that came when training gave way to instinct. Inside were 3 men, 2 already on the ground, hands behind their heads, the third crouched near a duffel bag zipped halfway open, the glint of sealed evidence bags poking from its mouth like a grin. She approached slowly, gun lowered but ready, her voice low. "Move, and I will end you where you stand." The man didn't speak. He looked up once, and in that brief glance, Elise saw the same thing she had seen a dozen times in her career. Not desperation, not regret, but calculation. The same cold math of someone who still believed they were one step ahead. She motioned to the agent beside her. "Cuff him, tag the bag, and scan the serials now." The agent complied without a word, hands quick and practiced, and as Elise turned toward the other 2, one of them spoke without being prompted. "We didn't know who it was," he said. "They just told us to move the product same as always." "Who gave the order?" Elise asked, her tone not rising but firm enough to make the man flinch. "Who gave you the target?" The man shook his head. "We never saw names, just drops, clean bags, same source every time." Elise stepped closer, kneeling slightly to meet his gaze. Then described the handler. "Tall white guy, mid-40s maybe, scar above the left brow, real quiet. always drove alone. Behind her, Naomi's voice crackled over the comm. "Director, we've secured the eastern perimeter. One runner caught heading toward the ravine. It's Reams." Elise stood, voice sharp now. "Alive, yes. Bruised, scared, still cocky. Says Hollister's not with him." "Then find Hollister," Elise replied. "And check the trucks. If there's more product, I want it cataloged and secured under triple seal. No local access." The command unit buzzed in her earpiece again. "We pulled the GPS logs off the central truck. They lead to a warehouse outside Lorton Heights. Name on the rental, Oren Vega." Elise's breath slowed. That name again. Always buried, always just beyond reach, now sitting on a lease form tied to a shipment meant to frame a federal director. "He's not done," she said quietly. "He's pulling us closer on purpose." Salgado emerged from the opposite door, dragging a man in tactical gear, half-conscious and coughing blood. "Hollister," he grunted. "Tried to play hero. Didn't work out." Elise approached slowly, kneeling beside the man who had once smiled while planting drugs in her trunk. His eyes fluttered open, and when they met hers there was no triumph left, just sweat, blood, and something sour behind his breath. "You're too late," he whispered. "You think this matters?" Elise leaned in, close her voice like steel drawn slow. "Number? But it's the beginning." And as the agents hauled him upright, zip ties biting into his wrists, Elise turned toward the horizon where the sky was beginning to pale into morning, and the wind, for the first time in weeks, carried the scent of something breaking open. The warehouse sat at the edge of a crumbling industrial park, hidden behind rust-stained fencing, and a row of derelict delivery trucks with flat tires and shattered windshields. The kind of place that didn't invite questions because it had already been forgotten by the city it once served. Elise stood just outside the loading dock, her breath slow but shallow, the dry morning air clinging to her skin as her eyes moved across the cracked cinder-block facade and the single security camera mounted above a crooked light fixture that hadn't worked in years. She could feel the weight of the silence inside the thick, humid kind that suggested something was waiting behind the walls. Not people necessarily, but answers. Salgado was at her side, clipboard in hand, his voice low as he reviewed the lease records again. Shell company registered out of Delaware, 2 years inactive, no name tied directly, but the bank account routing number matches a known alias from an old task force registry. That alias, he glanced up at her, Oren Vega. Elisa didn't flinch, didn't speak. She just stared at the steel roll-up door like it might blink first, her mind already assembling the timeline. Vega presumed dead in a car fire 7 years ago. Resurface signals traced through burner phones, his name showing up again in the GPS from the convoy truck. Too many coincidences in too few days. She stepped forward, motioning to the breach team to open the side entry. The door gave way with a screech, metal grinding against concrete, as the lock gave under pressure and the darkness inside wasn't pitch black, but murky, a dull green glow from backup power strips and half-lit servers, humming like distant insects. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and smelled faintly of ozone and scorched plastic, like someone had run a machine too hot for too long and left just before it failed. The room opened into a command nest, racks of equipment lining the walls, fiber cables snaking across the floor like veins, a central desk cluttered with keyboards, drives, and half-drunk bottles of water, all too recently placed to be abandoned for long. Elise stepped inside carefully, not out of fear but out of respect for what she was walking into, because this wasn't a hideout, it was a hub. Everything about the setup said intelligence, logistics, coordination. This wasn't built to stash product. It was built to move it silently, invisibly, through the one system designed to track everything, the federal network. "Get me a live scan on every hard drive," she said, her voice clipped but calm. "Don't touch anything that looks out of place. This entire grid could be hot-wired for remote wipe." Julia Kane had arrived minutes behind her and was already setting up her mobile extraction unit, fingers flying across the console as she bypassed the outer shell protections. "Director," she called out, "this system isn't just mirrored to our network. It's built on a cloned framework. It's Xeno, or a derivative of it, with local admin privileges spoofed from an old DEA key signature. Whoever ran this place wasn't just using our tools, they were perfecting them." Elise moved to the center desk and paused. Among the spread of cables and monitors, one file sat printed and folded in half a name, written in block letters across the top: E. Monroe. She picked it up, unfolded it carefully, and inside was a photograph, her booking photo time-stamped with a notation, scribbled across the bottom in red ink. Trigger successful. Alert delay 87 seconds. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the page, not in shock but in clarity. They were watching, she murmured. They wanted to know how long the system would take to react to a breach on me. Julia looked up sharply. Director, if they tested a delay on you, it means they were monitoring the Xeno failsafe in real time. They weren't scared of discovery, they were measuring response. Elise's voice was lower now, more deliberate, which means they were ready to disappear the second it went off. She set the paper down and scanned the room again. Check for recent external drives. I want timestamps of all activity in the last 48 hours, and start digging into the login history. Look for ghost identities, especially anything tied to Operation Holdback. A beat later, Naomi entered from the loading bay with a half-folded paper trail in hand. Lease agreements, shipping records, and inventory receipts, she said. All printed, no digital backups, but look at the names. Elise scanned the sheets and saw them counties she knew well from the map of vanished evidence officers she had already flagged in the cross-county sweep. It was all there, organized, precise, unafraid. And then Salgado's voice came from across the room. Director back here. Elise followed him to a small interior chamber behind a steel mesh gate. Inside, illuminated only by a desk lamp, sat a man, middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing a gray button-down shirt and no expression at all. His wrists were resting on the desk, palms flat, not restrained. When he looked up, Elise recognized him instantly, not from photos or files, but from every shadow the system had cast. Oren Vega. You finally found me, he said, voice even almost casual. Took longer than I thought. Elise didn't sit. She didn't reach for her gun. She just studied him, his face, his breathing, the way he watched her, like he was still writing the next chapter, not reading the end of his own. You used my name, she said quietly. You used Xeno to test federal thresholds and reauthorize black channels that were supposed to be buried a decade ago. Vega smiled faintly. I didn't break your system, he said. I just proved it still works exactly how it was designed. Elise took a slow breath, her voice steady. You're not a genius, Vega? You're a parasite with clearance. And we're cutting off the host, he chuckled softly. You can unplug the terminal, Director, but the network doesn't die with me. It never does. She turned to Naomi. Black out the building. Secure him for transport. And get every drive bagged for Level 1 analysis. No internal access. No review chain. As the agents moved in, Vega leaned back in his chair, his smile never fading. Be careful what you uncover, he said. Sometimes the truth doesn't free people. It just burns everything down. Elise didn't respond. She didn't have to, because in her mind, the fire had already started, and she wasn't trying to stop it. She was ready to walk through it. The chamber was colder than Elise expected, not from the temperature of the room, but from the kind of silence that settled when powerful people were forced to listen, not speak. The lights were bright but not harsh, casting a clinical glow over the semicircle of congressional seats before her, each chair filled with a face trained to show concern without commitment, curiosity without consequence. Behind her, the seal of the Department of Justice loomed on the wall, flanked by the American flag, and the federal eagle, both stiff and unmoved, as if they too had watched too many hearings that ended with too little change. Elise adjusted the microphone slowly, not to stall, but to center herself, her palms flat on the thick folder in front of her, which carried a truth heavier than any law yet written. Her eyes scanned the room once, making no effort to soften her expression, because what she was about to say wasn't meant to make anyone feel safe. It was meant to make them remember. My name is Elise Monroe, she began, her voice calm, but full, reaching into the corners of the chamber with a clarity that demanded presence. And I currently serve as Director of the Federal Office of Institutional Integrity. There was a pause, not for effect, but for weight. I am also the woman who was falsely arrested by 2 sworn officers who planted federally classified narcotics in my trunk and processed me without due cause, knowing neither my name nor the consequences of what they were triggering. A rustle swept through the room, papers, shifting pens, tapping small, involuntary movements that marked discomfort in men who weren't used to being told they had missed something this big. Elise continued, her tone unwavering. That arrest did not just expose 2 corrupt individuals or even a compromised department, it exposed a system. A ghost network that has operated beneath the surface of law enforcement for over a decade, reactivating decommissioned clearance codes, manipulating federal infrastructure and trafficking, seized evidence for profit protection and power. She opened the folder with practiced calm, lifting 1 page at a time as she spoke. We have traced the origins of this network to a legacy task force program known as Operation Holdback. Initially designed as a counter-cartel operation, it was later hijacked and evolved into an internal laundering mechanism. She laid out the names one by one, not in accusation, but in fact. Officers who had falsified reports, supervisors who had signed off on missing inventory, internal audit chains that had been manipulated by a tool called Xeno, a software framework never intended to exist beyond observation, but quietly weaponized into an untraceable data forging engine. It wasn't a flaw in the system, she said. It was the system built on the assumption that no one would ever follow the trail back to its roots. Behind her, screens illuminated with charts, timelines, and photos, not dramatic but surgical, each one placed with intent, forming a narrative not of conspiracy but of complicity. Elise's hand remained steady as she turned the pages. When the failsafe finally triggered, when my arrest sent an alert into the system, the men responsible vanished. They weren't caught by protocol, they were exposed by accident. Another silence swept across the room, deeper this time, not reactive but absorbing. Elise saw it in their eyes, the dawning understanding that this wasn't a single bad apple or a few overlooked cases. This was architecture. They used my name, she said quietly. They used my clearance to access black channels and reroute classified evidence. Every move they made was logged under my authority because the system was designed to trust the badge, not question it. One senator leaned forward, finally speaking. Director Monroe, how many agencies do you believe have been compromised by this network? Elise didn't hesitate. More than we're willing to admit, but fewer than we can still stop if we act now. She closed the folder, then slowly, deliberately, and placed both hands on the table before her. This wasn't about hiding drugs. This was about hiding decisions, who was protected, who was sacrificed, who was disposable. And if we continue to treat it like a scandal instead of a structural failure, we'll see it return under a different name with different players wearing the same uniforms. The room went still, not out of respect but reckoning. She sat back slightly, letting the final words settle in the air. We cannot legislate trust back into the system, but we can rebuild it with transparency, with accountability, and with the acknowledgement that silence, whether in courtrooms or committee rooms, is what allowed this to grow in the first place. Behind her, the screen faded to black. No applause followed. There were no gestures of triumph. Just the sound of shifting chairs, the low murmur of aides passing notes, and the sense that something had finally cracked open, not loudly, but permanently. Outside the chamber, the hallway buzzed with press, their cameras hovering, their voices raised in rehearsed urgency. Elise stepped past them without comment, her security detail flanking her, not for protection but for pace. Naomi caught up beside her, holding a sealed case file and a half-smile that never reached her eyes. 17 precincts flagged for emergency audit this morning, she said. 6 officers turned themselves in. 3 more disappeared overnight. Elise nodded once her tone clipped. We keep going. We don't stop until the infrastructure rots in daylight. Salgado approached from the elevator, holding a tablet with the latest feed from Internal Affairs. Xeno nodes have been locked out of federal servers. The architecture's been mapped, mirrored, and shut down. We have digital confirmation. It's dead. Elise didn't stop walking, but her voice dropped to a whisper only they could hear. Then now we deal with what it built. As they exited the building, the light had changed. The The city was still loud, still flawed, still a place where systems sometimes failed and justice came late. But it was also a place where for the first time, in a long time, the silence had been broken by something other than grief. Elise looked out over the plaza, the people gathering, not in protest but in expectation, and knew that the story they had been telling was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to everyone who had once believed the system couldn't change, and now it had no choice but to. The sun hung low over the capital, casting long golden shadows across the plaza, where only a few months earlier Elise had stood as a witness to a system's unraveling. Now, as she stepped out of the secured black SUV and onto the granite steps of the newly restored FOII headquarters, the air carried something different. Stillness. Yes, but not silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a long storm where the ground is still wet, the trees still bent, but the light finally breaks through without apology. The new signage above the doors hadn't changed much in design, but beneath it a new symbol glinted in bronze, a lamp with an open flame surrounded by 3 words: accountability, oversight, integrity. Inside the lobby buzzed with quiet activity. New recruits moved with purpose between briefings and baseline training analysts, reviewed cases under watchful guidance, and the transparent walls of the internal audit division pulsed with a quiet energy that hadn't existed before the reckoning. Elise walked through the space without ceremony, her presence still commanding but not theatrical, the kind of respect earned not through title but through the way she had stood firm and unflinching when every excuse to look away had been handed to her on a silver tray. She entered the executive wing where the lights were lower, the hum of electronics softened by acoustic panels and walls lined with digital displays showing the real-time activity of compliance teams across multiple districts. Naomi Kersey waited near the main terminal dressed in slate-gray tablet in hand, her gaze steady as she handed over the latest figures from the Lamar system, the national platform named in honor of Jordan whose truth had lit the fuse. I could no longer ignore. No anomalies, Naomi said quietly. All precinct audits logged, evidence trails verified, response compliance holding at 98%. Elise gave a small nod, her eyes scanning the numbers, not looking for error but for progress, because the battle wasn't to expose anymore, it was to ensure nothing fell back into shadow. "We did it," Naomi said softly. Elise didn't smile, but her voice held a warmth that hadn't been there in months. "No," she replied, "we're just beginning to do it right." In the lower wing, a ceremony was being held, not public, not for press, but for staff, the kind of moment that mattered more than headlines. Elise stood before a modest podium facing the newest class of FOII officers, each one in uniform, each one having completed a training program designed not to teach them how to enforce, but how to listen, how to question, and how to document with eyes wide open. Behind them on a raised screen, the Lamar Systems interface pulsed steadily, every case cross-referenced in real time, every signature traceable, every gap challenged. She didn't read from notes. She didn't speak long. "You're not here to carry a badge," she said calmly. "You're here to carry weight, the kind that doesn't come with glory but with consequence." Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because the room was already quiet in the way that meant people were listening not to respond but to understand. "The moment you step into a station, you're not there to be feared," she added. "You're there to see what others ignored, to hear what others buried, and to speak even when it would be easier not to." As the room dismissed and the agents began to disperse, Elise walked past them slowly, offering nods of acknowledgement, not authority, and when one young officer, barely 23, wide-eyed but grounded, approached and asked, "Director, how do we know when we've done enough?" She paused, looked him in the eye and said, "When silence becomes a choice again, not a symptom." Back in her office, she removed her coat, folded it neatly, and placed it over the back of the chair by the window that overlooked the city. The light had shifted again, warmer now, lower pulling long beams across the floor, where the wood glowed like it remembered a fire, but didn't need one anymore. She sat for a moment, letting her body relax into the stillness she hadn't allowed herself in months. On the edge of her desk sat the final audit report. 73 officers investigated 34 federally charged 21, who testified in exchange for immunity that would come with oversight and internal flags, 12 who had resigned quietly into obscurity, and 6 who would never answer another question. The number didn't feel like victory. It felt like evidence, not of the crime itself, but of how deeply it had embedded before anyone said enough. Her eyes lingered on the photo of Jordan Lamar framed on the bookshelf, his smile caught in that moment before adulthood began, frozen by someone who loved him, who never imagined it would be the last image that mattered. Elise stood across the room and straightened the frame slightly, then whispered the same words she had whispered on the courthouse steps weeks before. "They won't forget you again." Outside, the streets were noisy again. Horns, footsteps, laughter, wind. But underneath it, something else now hummed, a system that was finally paying attention. Elise returned to her desk, opened a clean folder labeled only with the date, and began drafting a new directive, one that would require every federal precinct to submit not just evidence inventories, but narrative reports explaining why each item mattered. Not for oversight, but for memory. Because the only way to keep a system honest was to make it remember what it had tried to forget. Not just the crimes, not just the officers, but the people, the lives, the silence that once cost too much. And this time she would make sure it stayed loud. What this story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see history repeat itself, is that silence can be dangerous when it's used to hide injustice, but powerful when it's broken for the sake of truth. Elise Monroe's journey wasn't just about catching a few bad actors. It was about pulling back the curtain on an entire system that had quietly failed the very people it was meant to protect. She didn't chase headlines. She chased accountability. And in doing so, she proved that real change doesn't come from loud promises, but from quiet, relentless courage. For those watching, especially our older viewers, who know what it means to carry the weight of untold stories, this is your reminder. It's never too late to ask the hard questions, to demand better, and to protect the next generation from the mistakes ours refused to confront. Whether you wore a uniform, sat in a courtroom, raised a child, or just lived through decades of seeing right and wrong blurred, you matter in the fight for integrity. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or reminded you of something that still needs fixing, please like this video, share it with someone who still believes in truth, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that don't just entertain, but awaken. Because the only way we keep the system honest is by making sure it knows we're still watching.